We're going to have an exciting talk tonight if our speaker shows. I think he's going to. But he's not here yet, so there's drama and tension to keep us all on the edge of our seat. Welcome to Ember.js NYC. My name is Luke Melia. I'm the organizer here. I'll tell you just a little bit about how tonight's going to go. We are going to start off the night with a demo of a new e-commerce site called Lightprint. We're going to have a talk and demo of Zool, of Ghostbuster fame. Anybody? Which is some really slick testing work that Roman over here in the red beanie's been doing. And we're going to follow up with a demo and some talk about what Dennis learned in an app that he's been doing that's kind of fashion industry oriented. And then Alex Machnier, assuming he appears, is going to do the main talk of the evening about Angular from an Ember developer's perspective. So exciting lineup. Before we get into some announcements and so forth, I want to thank our sponsors. Pivotal Labs is where we are all here and whose pizza we are eating and drinks we are enjoying. Pivotal has been an amazing host for the Ember meetup since very early in our life. For those of you who don't know, Pivotal is a agile consultancy. They also have been increasingly building some very cool products. Some of you may have used Pivotal Tracker in the past. Pivotal is always looking for both new clients and talented developers. So if you're interested in either of those, you should talk to Micah Young, who's there in the back. Wave, Micah. Mike has been here at Pivotal for a couple of years and is also my brother-in-law, so we're keeping it all in the family. He's a very good guy, too. And then our other sponsor is Yap, who's got the key sponsorship spot here on my chest. This is my company, and Yap is a consumer internet and mobile startup where we create a platform for regular folks to be able to create mobile applications, and we have a Ember consulting side of the company as well that's been doing some consulting for some of the most innovative companies in New York who are adopting Ember. So thank you to both of those folks. A couple of announcements, logistics for the meetup. You are at the November meetup tonight. There is, after discussion with Pivotal, I think there is not going to be a December meetup. Because of the holidays, we are usually the third week of the month, and obviously the third week of December is a pretty terrible time to have a meetup. So we're just going to take a break. I think that we are going to try to run hacker hours. I don't have a date for that yet, sometime in early December. So keep an eye on the meetup for that, and then we'll be back on January 23rd, which I've just posted to the meetup. We're looking for talks and demos for that night, so talk to me if you're interested. A few more announcements. Can I get Johnny to come up and grab a mic? Johnny's going to tell us a little bit about Code Now, and this marks his third consecutive month being with a mic in the front of the room at Ember meetup.
All right, so Code Now is a charity. I'm going to make this really quick. Just want to get this over, get this out of the way. Code Now is a charity. They teach kids how to program. All the kids qualify for free or reduced lunch. At the end of the program, they get a laptop. Great thing. I volunteer here as often as I can. It's really hard work. It's great for the soul. If you know Ruby, then you are qualified to volunteer. So I just wanted to say that if you're interested in helping kids, which I am, then go to codenow.org, register your interest as a volunteer, and get involved.
Awesome. Thank you. Definitely great cause. Cool. Some more announcements from around the Ember world. Since we last got together, Ember 1.12 was released. You can see the Ember blog for details. We also saw the release of a beautiful little website with some cool open source Ember components from Adapar, which is a company out on the West Coast that does some awesome stuff. So you can see that they've released an Ember table component, Ember charts, and Ember widgets, which uses the CSS from Bootstrap and marries it with Ember components. And if you are familiar with Bootstrap, the CSS is definitely the good part from Bootstrap. Emberfest, which had its first incarnation several months back, has been announced for 2014. This is the European Ember Conference. It's going to be in Barcelona next year. And I believe, I don't know if registration is open, but you can at least sign up for the mailing list over at emberfest.eu. This is billed as the biggest Ember.js event in Europe. I think that that's definitely true. And if you're interested in knowing a little bit more about it, Matthew Beal spoke at the one that recently occurred, so he can tell you a little bit more about what it was like. There was Lagerhosen. I don't know what that is. There's also been some rumblings, this is in the rumor phase, but there's been some rumblings about a Q1 Ember camp in the US, most likely in the Pacific Northwest, Portland perhaps. So stay tuned to the Twitter web for that. Last year's sold out, it was the first one and sold out pretty quickly, so definitely stay tuned. A shameless plug. You may have noticed something looks a little different up in the front of the room this month. I've been growing out my stash ostensibly to raise money for a good cause, which is Movember, raises money for research into men's prostate cancers. I don't think that I've actually raised any money yet, though. So this is where you all can help me out. You can go to us.movember.com and search for Luke Melia and throw a few bucks into the kitty. My wife will be very appreciative that this was not for naught. Last thing I wanted to mention here is that there's been some exciting work on a project called Ember App Kit Rails. For those of you who are familiar with it and those of you who aren't, Ember App Kit is a project designed to be a really nice way to start up a new Ember project, leveraging a module system, specifically ES6 modules, and hooking that directly into Ember's dependency injection system to create a really elegant process where in order to add a new component or a new type of file to your project, you just put it in the right folder and name it the right thing, and it's instantly available to your Ember application. So those of you who have used it know how nice it is. We're now bringing that niceness to people who are using Ember Rails, which is exciting. And the folks up at Dockyard in Boston have been doing a bunch of work on that. You can find it at dockyard/ember-appkit-rails over on GitHub. Ember App Kit itself continues to evolve as well. Thomas Boyd, who's down in the front, has been doing a bunch of work, as well as other folks. It recently gained Windows compatibility thanks to somebody whose real name I don't know, but goes by Major Breakfast on GitHub. So thank you to Major Breakfast. I want to turn the floor over to you guys for announcements. This could be events, people hiring, people looking to be hired. Anybody have anything they want to share?
Hi, I'm Jason Weber from S&P Capital IQ. We're actually doing some Ember development, actually, along with Yap Labs. We are looking to hire front-end developers, especially people with Ember experience or other JavaScript libraries. So hop on to capitaliq.com if you have any interest and shoot us your resume. Thanks.
Awesome. Cool. Anybody else? Going once, twice. Great. So if I can get Kevin to come up and plug in, we will get rolling with the program.
So just a little bit about me. I own a photo lab down on the Lower East Side. I actually started my background is photography. I went to school for photography. And my first job out of school actually was for Dugal, who I'm sure everyone's heard of. My next job was for a company called Razorfish. Has anyone heard of that? Okay, so I was hacking HTML in the 90s and then was like, this sucks, I hate this. It was very impermanent, and I decided, you know what, I need to get back into photography. It's tangible, it's material. So I give that intro just because this site, in an odd way, is sort of like everything for me coming full circle. And it just went live like last night. So I'm feeling a great sigh of relief. I'm sure people can identify. So what we do is we do photographic printing. This is something it's becoming a bit of an endangered species these days because everything's kind of moving towards inkjet. And so the point of this site is to emphasize that we use light to print. It's a bit 8th grader, but that's marketing. Anyway, but onto the Ember bit. Well, a little bit background about the site. This is a Rails app with an Ember front-end component. It's Rails 3215, Ember 1, yeah, close to my, Canary something or other. And it's built on something called Spree, which I don't know if anybody is from Rails world knows Spree. Spree is a gem built on Rails that is an e-commerce solution for Rails. It's probably the most popular. Anyway, I was struggling with Spree, getting sort of the experience that I wanted, and I came to a meetup, an Ember meetup last February, and suddenly my eyes were open up to this new wonderful technology called Ember. I thought, awesome, this is going to be great. And then I tried to learn it, and it was like, holy shit, this is hard. This is really fucking hard. Luckily, I made some friends while I was here and enlisted their help. So the Ember component here was written pretty much mostly by Luke and Stefan. Okay, the Yap crew, and this is it. So the basic concept is fairly simple, nothing new at this point in 2013. Upload some files, check out. What's new is, or at least unique for me, is the Ember. So it's HTML5 Blue Imp uploader hitting the Rails server now. Hopefully live demo. These actually come back from the server. Polling. It would be perfect that this. A live demo. All right, let's see here. I'm going to try. Okay, so. Yeah, does appear to be on. Charlie, you crashed it. This may be DigitalOcean.
If you want, we can use
Yeah, I mean, I can. second. Bear with me. Two seconds. So, we're seeing one of the barely tested features here, which is new with this iteration, which is a backgrounding process for the previews, and it's been working in the last 24 hours, but there we go. So yeah, any Rails developers out there want to help me with this? Sorry? I do, but right now, this is quote unquote live, but it's turned off from the search engines, and we're not using this quite yet. So I haven't implemented my worker process in my Capistrano recipe. I tested it 10 minutes ago, so I'm going to have to look into some sort of something to catch it when it dies and restart it. But in either case, this is actually a known problem with this particular architecture because it was built on Rails and because we're handling the images on our actual server. That actually goes back to when I started this maybe 2 years ago. We really needed to handle high res, and S3 wasn't quite doing it. And so back then 2 years ago, we weren't handling a lot of uploads. So it was more like, I just need these big files from a few people, just get them to us. So we built it with this architecture where the stuff is being done on the server, but the next step for this is to make all the image processing be done via a cloud, so it's scalable. Because right now, this, as beautiful as this app is, it's not incredibly scalable unless I get into load balancing and all this sort of stuff. But back to Ember. So so here's Ember. We've got, this was challenging for Luke, not so much from the Ember. I think it was mostly challenging in a pre-existing Rails app, barely existing Spree API, and getting that to and fro with Ember. I know that that was challenging for Luke, and honestly, way past, way above my head. I feel like I could probably do the tutorial on doing a to-do app in Ember, but this was, this required a professional. So, but he did it. So some of the cool features, so we have, this is meant for professionals, but we don't discriminate. We don't have any sort of, we only work with these kind of clients. So we do get consumers to professionals, but we have professional options, which includes like gallery quality mounting. And all the specifics of that can be quite complicated, which this handles very elegantly. If you don't know what this is, we have these drop downs. This sort of solves some problems. Eventually we'll have videos. It has a cropping feature, which is super cool. And what's exceptionally cool is that on the fly, we're getting these previews. This is probably one of the biggest problems that we encounter as a photo lab is aspect ratio. It's probably the most common. Soon to be integrated here is like a quality indicator. So we're reading the file, looking at the pixel count, and returning. At this print size, you're okay, or you have a problem. You can get away with it, but not a good idea. So that's the next sort of iteration for this. So this theoretically has also crashed. Anyway, so I don't, basically I was up till 1 o'clock getting this live on the server. We've got some issues to work out. I've got some issues to work out. That's not a new one with me. So the coolest thing about this whole process was yesterday when I wasn't having server problems. For the first time, I turned on my iPad, went to this address, and it worked. I don't really have any way of plugging this in, do I? But I'm just going to hold it up. You can kind of use your imagination. But so it let me grab from my iPad and it basically has pretty much exactly the same functionality right off my iPad. So, and all this sort of full-featuredness that like native-like experience that we get out of that without having to build a native app. So to me, that's sort of the coolest thing that Ember represents. The cropper actually works, including tap and drag events. You can crop with it the same. It's pretty amazing. That's all for free from Ember, right?
Yeah, I think somebody asked me earlier, the meetup started, about Ember and responsive design.
Right.
So maybe if you refresh this and show kind of what happens when you change the width of the browser.
Sure. Yeah. So this is built with Bootstrap, and yes, thank you, Luke, for reminding me of. So what's really cool is you could theoretically do this with an iPhone. I don't recommend doing that right now. So we've tested the server a little bit, but because basically these options will follow the thumbnail. And then, yeah, so I probably wouldn't recommend trying it on an iPhone, but certainly being able to... It works? Awesome. Yeah, so despite the typical live demo snafus, I'm super excited about this, what it means for us down the line. Hopefully, within a year, this will be a little bit more scalable, and then hopefully things for us will start to really take off. But I love Ember. I definitely come from a web background. I believe in the web, and I don't want to learn native. So, yeah. Anyway, thank you.
Any questions for Kevin?
That's a Luke. So the question is, with mobile, how did you integrate the tap events? Is that a good summation? I'm going to give that to Luke.
Was it about yeah.
After Bootstrap gave you the layout.
Right. So Kevin hired a talented designer to design this thing and to build HTML and CSS for it. And I did not touch that much. I have to touch that much, and most of the responsiveness is in the CSS. There's a little bit of stuff in the grid of photos that the basic approach we took is to subscribe to window resize event handler, and then translate that into a width property, or a width property on that grid view, and then there's some math to figure out How many can I display? What does that mean for where the detail view appears and below and so forth? But that's pretty much it. So my answer to the person V, whoever it is, who asked earlier tonight about responsive is that Ember's kind of the web, and so you want to be responsive. It's mostly CSS, and there's some bits of different functionality and different DOM components that Ember can play into, typically by interacting with the resize handler.
But the events, is that true?
Oh, sorry. And so to the question of like touch and tap, so on the cropping, we use jcrop, which is a jQuery plugin that does cropping. And we hooked it up to Ember as appropriate and let it do its thing where it's good at it. And that came for free. All the other taps and clicks come essentially for free just by virtue of mobile Safari converting touches to clicks. So we kept it super simple. There's not a lot. I mean, you can get a lot deeper, but it was not necessary for this. Cool.
Thank you.
All right, awesome. Thanks, Kevin. And the other thing I wanted, awesome. For those of you who have attended the Hacker Hours, Kevin is one of the co-organizers of the Hacker Hours, so we appreciate his contribution to the community. Next, I want to bring up Roman, who at the last Hacker Hours, in fact, connected his screen to the TV over at Simple Reach, and he demoed something that blew me away at how elegant and simple it was. And so I reached out to him after Hacker Hours and said, hey, would you be up for sharing this with a larger group? And he was. Roman is not this one is going to be the one that works. Looks like one of those guys. Roman is not an Ember developer, but specifically, but he is a very talented JavaScript developer and Node developer, and I think you're going to be impressed with what he has to share tonight.
If anyone's wondering why I'm wearing a suit, it's because JavaScript is serious business. I don't kid around. All right. So I'm going to be a little preachy at first, and then I'm going to show you the tool, and then, you can find me afterwards on Twitter, GitHub. You can stalk me maybe at other JavaScript meetups or anything like that. I'll try and keep it short and brief, but these are going to be some testing tips, and maybe you'll learn something. As Luke said, I don't do any Ember. I don't know anything about Ember. I don't use Rails. I don't know anything about Rails. What I do is a lot of JavaScript. And I do a lot of JavaScript for other people, their contributions, and their open source projects. So I see a lot of different testing frameworks. I see a lot of different styles of JavaScript. I see a lot of different mistakes all over the place, right? My background is in full stack JavaScript, right? I started doing JavaScript from Node.js and things like that. And all of that carried over into how I do front-end JavaScript. I don't do front-end JavaScript like most of you people probably do front-end JavaScript. And there's a reason for that. It allows me to iterate faster, and a lot of my code structure is sane as a result. But server-side testing is way easier than client-side testing, if you've ever tested your Rails app or any other app or anything like that. Browser testing sucks. When I started looking at writing client-side code and doing browser testing, it was really complicated. There's like a lot of boilerplate you have to write, bring in a lot of scripts. There's these all-or-nothing libraries. You really have to kind of learn 300 different things before you can even make your tests run in your own browser. That's kind of really annoying. Testing should not be this painful. If it's painful, you're just not going to do it, right? So, simple rules for testing. This is where I get to be a little preachy. You can ignore it if you want. Tests do not prove that your code is bug-free, right? They only show some expected behavior. So don't think that you wrote some tests and now everything is magical. Tests are just programs. I see people getting really creative with their tests. All sorts of describing and speccing and just all sorts of bootstrap scripts to make your tests even run. Your tests should really be like the code in your examples or the code you're writing. It shouldn't be some complicated, over-engineered thing. And your tests are safety harness, right? You're probably still going to have bugs, things are going to fail, but the tests will definitely help you. And the biggest thing I've learned is you should test the pieces first, right? starting to test your entire app can be a very, overwhelming thing at first. But if you just pick a little function or a little piece or something like that and you start testing that, you'll get better results really quickly, right? So, biggest thing that I've learned is dry, right? Don't repeat yourself. If you see yourself doing the same thing over and over again, look for a tool, look for something that is going to help you do that. And that's what I'm here to talk about, right? Okay? So that's what I'm here to talk about with Zool. So Zool is this test runner, essentially, that I built over the course of just a few days, mostly to do the simple harnessing work, right? For, I think, now I'm going to talk a little Ember land. I think most Ember people are familiar with QUnit style testing, I think. I use a lot of Mocha QUnit style testing, but it's the same idea, right? So if you want to do tests in a browser, you have to typically, let's bring up some code. Let's see, everything is so tiny on these screens, I can't even see. Let's see if we can do this. Can I turn off Solarized? So I can try, but it's going to look terrible because all of my themes, it's going to be bad. Oh, I can do that. We'll disable for an hour. Is that better? Whatever. Okay. So, okay. So I attended this Ember Hacker Hours, I think it was like 2 weeks ago or something like that, where I first demoed this tool, and what was showed for test harness setup there was an index file that looked kind of like this, right? If we look at this file, we see that we have our test fixtures, we bring in our QUnit, we bring in our jQuery, we bring in our handlebars, we bring in some sort of f.js script. It was needed. I'm not quite sure why. Again, I don't really write Ember, so. And then we bring in Ember data. This is all pretty typical. This is just some HTML. You guys write it all the time. And then you brought in your posts or whatever. So this is cool. If we go back to our nice browser, let's see if I can bring this up. That's what I just cloned. So yeah, that runs the QUnit tests, right? That's all well and good. We ran them locally. That's great. Our tests pass. We feel happy. We go home at the end of the day. And tomorrow we wake up to 500 emails from Safari users because the shit doesn't work in Safari, right? Because, who knows? Browsers do all sorts of awesome things. So what we can do instead is we can take our mind away from this type of writing boilerplate. We can write our tests, leave them as is, and just leave all the boilerplate nonsense to the test running tool we use, right? And the advantage of this is that we get a lot more flexibility if we do this, right? So if I go back to the Ember directory that I cloned, what we can see here is that it looks very similar to the other directory. There's just no index file, right? Instead of the index.html file, what we have is the same tests. The test file, by the way, is just simple QUnit style tests where you do your app setup for testing, all these magical incantations that probably mean something to you guys. They don't mean anything to me. You do all this, but what we do here instead is that there's also this little magical file called a zool.yaml file, right? And it's called zool.yaml because the tool I wrote is Zool, right? And in this file, we have UI says QUnit because we're going to use the QUnit testing framework. HTML template, that's some of our handlebar scripts. I think you guys are really big fan of handlebars and these fancy scripting languages. So you got to bring in some of those. And then the scripts we're going to load, right? So from here, it's kind of similar to what we wrote by hand before. But what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and do, we're now using Zool, right? So we're going to tell Zool to run a server with these tests. And it gives us a nice URL. We're just going to go ahead and open it here, hopefully. Okay, so our tests, 0 ran, who knows, I don't know why. This is a live demo, so it's probably going to fail. It failed because I didn't say what file, right? You got to give it a file or directory full of tests. Anyhow, we're going to go back here. Okay, cool. Our tests ran. That's exciting. It's the same shit I just showed you. I'm wasting your time, right? But the more exciting thing with Zool is that because we've let Zool run our server and instrument our tests, we can now do the other thing that Zool is very good at. And Zool will run your tests in cloud browsers. And that's where the key comes in. So if we look at this Zool.yaml file, you see that it's pretty straightforward. But if I go ahead and edit this file, and I do Chrome, we're going to use just the keyword latest. Zool has, actually we'll do more. We'll do, okay. So what we're going to tell Zool is we want to test in Chrome version 28 all the way up to the latest version that's supported in whatever we're going to test in, right? So now what we do is we run Zool and we give it that test file. Hopefully, you know, if the internet gods are, you know, favoring on us, we see something that says testing Google Chrome, Windows 8, versions 28, 29, queuing these versions, these browsers, right? So it just spews some text about the hope and the prayer we have that this code is actually being tested on these browsers. It's not actually, I'm just printing this stuff in pretty colors to the console, nothing's actually happening. No, that's a lie, actually. So if we go back to my Sauce Labs account, we can see that these tests are actually running right now, right? There is only Zool, just the fake name of the project I gave it. And so what's happening is our tests are running in these other browsers, right? And so we get very good browser coverage. We get different operating systems, we get different browser versions. Sauce Labs actually has iPads, Android tablets, iPhone testing. So you get all that. So we see all our tests passed, but I can actually click on this. This is Chrome version 30. And this is Sauce Labs stuff. I didn't do this, right? I just integrate with it. But we see, you know, here's the video. We can play our video of our tests and we can see it all, right? And these are our tests running in all these different browsers without us having to do any extra like work. It was the same tests, right? We just got away from that thinking of writing that boilerplate by hand. So that's what Zool does. And kind of to wrap it all up, what I do for a lot of my modules, let's say I have this module right here. I have to search my repositories. There's a lot of them. So let's say I want to write a module that's like DOM events or something, right? This is pretty typical. I want to write some sort of event handler or some non-GUI element, some code that's going to run in various browsers, and I want to make sure that it's going to work in those different browsers, right? So what I do is I write some tests. You know, this is Mocha QUnit style. Oh, Jesus. There we go. This is Mocha QUnit style, but it's the same idea, right? I have a test, I write a function, same thing. And then what I do in my package JSON, and I know this is going to scare some of you guys because you equate this like with Node and NPM, and that's a bad place you don't want to go sometimes. But you don't have to put your code on NPM to use this. All the package JSON file is going to do is have this nice little line in here that has this test Zool test line. And this is really cool because what happens here is, for those of you that are big fans of Travis, is every time I push to this repo, what's going to happen is, because I've connected the Travis commit hook, Travis is going to check out my repo, and we see Travis ran Zool. In this case, I have all sorts of tests running through Zool, all the way from IE6 to the latest, all sorts of Chrome versions, and we see here that my build was green only after it passed in all of those browsers, right? So this is really awesome for if you're working on a function or a library or something you need run in lots of different browsers, and you don't have the browsers on your machine or the virtual machines or the time to test all that, you know, or maybe you miss a semicolon in an object and IE shits itself because that's what IE is going to do, right? So this will let you catch all that before you deploy your code. Zool is on GitHub. It's not a very complicated project, pretty straightforward. I have a very nice wiki of like quick start, how to set up your Sauce Labs account, how to connect it to Travis, all of that's written about. Obviously you can bug me on Twitter, and hopefully you find use in the tool. It's made to make your life easier, so that's all I got.
Questions for Roman?
No questions. I've answered all of them. Awesome.
Anybody have a testing framework that is as slick as this on their project?
It's not a testing framework. I don't like the term
Good point.
framework. It's a testing tool.
Testing process. Who has a testing process that is this slick? This is awesome. Thank you so much for your contributing and for sharing with us tonight. Appreciate it.
Thanks.
I think 2 Ember meetups ago, I made an announcement about an apprentice program that we were starting at Yap, and Michael, who's in the audience somewhere, had just graduated from that program, and so we were opening it up to some new folks, and somebody who I didn't know came up to me afterwards and said, "Hey, I'm interested." So we chatted a little bit, decided to give it a shot. And he's been very successful in the role and really learning a ton fast. And at the last hacker hours, he showed me something that he was working on the side that really blew me away. And so I asked him to share it with the meetup tonight. So I'm happy to share with you in perhaps his first professional software development presentation, Dennis
Yes.
Nazarev.
Hello, is it working? Do I look like Tom Cruise from that movie? I'm Dennis. I've been apprenticing at Yap and doing some freelance web development on the side. It was amazing working with Yap, and I've learned an insane amount just being there 2 days a week, and they have some amazing engineers that just throw a lot of amazing information at you. This is my presentation. So this is a multimedia application, which is a very vague description of it, and a little more specific is it's a website I was contacted to work on a website for a fashion designer, and they created this long multimedia video, this high budget video with these beautiful cuts, and the site was made to illustrate these lookbooks where it was basically an image slideshow where you go to see all the different looks this designer has made. But they had this crazy twist where they wanted to, instead of a photo slideshow, they wanted to have a video slideshow. So there were all these heavy assets, big videos, big images, and we wanted to crossfade videos. And I've been using Ember, I wanted to use Ember, and then I started thinking about how I'm going to architect this project, and animations are notoriously extremely difficult in Ember. Ember wants to fetch JSON and just render your route and render your view, and when you go to a different view, it wants to destroy all those views and add new views. To add animations, it's very difficult, and there's no idea of waiting for there's your JSON promise, but there's no idea of like a video loaded promise, and I just didn't know what to do. So I'm going to first demo what I came up with in the end, and then we're going to go back and I'm going to try to explain how I came up with everything. The website is called, the designer is called Telfar, and this is the splash page. And then some things that aren't working, so I'm just going to show you the different components individually. So things to keep an eye on is the URL and how it's changing and just how things are interacting, and you're going to understand how this works. So the videos crossfade, the view fades out and fades in, and now we're going to see how this all worked in the end. I wanted to lock my route and not transition to the next route until I was able to play the video, so I had to preload the video and wait for the callback that the video is ready to play. and the other part was animating. I wanted to do crossfades. And when you're in a route, so this is all one view and one route, and here only the model is changing. So the bound attributes for the image are updating, and the view itself isn't changing, so I can't, there's no way to hook into crossfading the view because just the image source attribute is what's updating. And doing a little research, there was Ember animated outlet, which has that same problem. You cannot, when you change the model within the same route, you cannot update it because it uses a container view on the outlet, and there's a current view will change binding, and it's not triggered because you're not changing the view. You can only animate when you leave one view and go to a different view. So this was no good for me. So my solution was to roll your own. Ember is very complicated for me because I'm just learning it, so I couldn't just dive into the core and try to like come up with an animated route solution. So I thought I could just break up the problem into small pieces, and if the final product is working the way it's supposed to be, no matter how bad the practices were, it's going to be okay. So these are the tricks I used. I came up with a crossfade video container. So the videos you see, they live on the application template level, and when you are in the route and the video changes, the video sends up a new URL, and on the application level, because that view never changes, they will crossfade at that level. And then just to make it simple and decoupled was a good way to keep me sane, because first I was trying to do very complicated things, reaching from the router into the view, but I decided to create a container view. So what is a container view? Container view is an Ember view subclass that implements Ember mutable array, allowing programmatic management of child views. So I was going to have, at a time, two video views that were going to be layered on top of each other with absolute CSS positioning, and I was going to crossfade them one to the other. So in application, is that really small? So in application handlebars, there was the crossfade video container view, which had a binding to the video URL. And this is the container view that I created. It observes the URL, and when the URL changes, it adds a new view. And there's a sub view, which is the full screen video view. That was another thing I created, which allowed me to have this video background that scales, which is just a little math. So this new view is added. It has a fade transition, and the other view is faded out, and when it's faded out, it's destroyed. And that's basically it. The video itself, what was interesting about that was responding to CSS events, and when you add a transition to a CSS class, you can listen to that element's transition end event, and that's what I was using to tell Ember that the transition was ended and that the view could be destroyed. Yeah. And the other thing to do was, I didn't want the route to change until the next video was ready to play. And this was complicated because, as I was saying before, Ember just wants to load new JSON and just deal with very basic data and textual data, not multimedia data. And multimedia is not handled as the model hook or the data coming into the route, but it's completely different. It would render into your template, and you just let it load on its own. But I wanted the route transition to synchronize to that. So a way I came up with locking the route from transitioning was if you return a promise in the model hook or the after model hook, the route will not enter into the new route until that promise resolves. And a good way to do that is with Ember deferred. And Ember deferred is basically a promise wrapped in an object, and you can call dot resolve on that object, and it will resolve the promise. And the code for that. So I created a mixin that I passed to all these routes that would need to be locked and wait for multimedia to load. So the interesting thing here is when I enter a new route, I need to tell, this new route needs to know about the previous route. So when a route transitions, I set on the global router previous route to this, so the next route knows about the previous route. So when we enter the next route, it checks if there's a previous route. I send a command to the previous route called cleanup. And cleanup creates this member deferred object, and on that route's controller, it sets a cleanup promise. So this allows that route's view to listen to observe controller cleanup promise and do what it needs to know. And this follows the MVC pattern, and it keeps the route knows about the controller, and the view knows about the controller. So the route can set something on the controller, but the controller doesn't need to know about the view, but the view can listen to something on the controller. And when the cleanup promise updates, the view can fade itself out, and when it fades itself out, this callback returns, and the promise is resolved, and that view will just be destroyed normally the way Ember works. So this allowed me to lock this transition. So if you will see how the video starts fading right when the number and the route changes. And this allowed me to preserve the back button functionality, which would be extremely difficult in Backbone or something like that, and then the website works, the URLs and the history states work just the way they should. So other things that I learned was there's a lot of interaction with jQuery events, and you have to be careful with binding these events and then removing them when your view is destroyed. Otherwise, you'll have these hanging events bound to the global window resize that you get all kinds of errors if you destroy your view and you're trying to resize the window. So you create an event handler and did insert an element, remove one on this will destroy element, and then you pass a named function with the proper view context as a handler. And let's look at that. So in the window on resize, when that fires and this callback is called, that callback's context will be the window, the browser window. And so if you just, for example, if you put apply resize, which is the views method in here, any calls to this wouldn't work because the context would be the window. So you have to create this bound apply resize, which gives the context of the view. And you have to name it because you want the pointer to that function, and because when you will destroy element, you want to unbind it. So this will allow you to cleanly add these event handlers and remove them if the view gets destroyed. The other thing with jQuery events is they will, if you do not use the Ember run loop, you will get conflicts and unexpected behavior will happen. So because I'm using the CSS transition end event, when I return my callback, I need to wrap that in an Ember run. So if there's any property bindings, they need to update accordingly. And if I put it on the Ember run loop, I am safe from any unexpected behavior. So what I learned was if I break up complex ideas into simple parts, that I'm able to work on these small things and stay sane about their interfaces and debugging them instead of trying to do very complicated and like reaching across the whole framework. And like hopefully Alex will speak about this, that negative things people say about Angular is that you can inject anything into anything, and just because you can will lead to people doing very, very bad things. So if I follow MVC and the route will set up the controller, the view will listen to changes on the controller and respond accordingly, and not like these long reaches into different things. It'll be much easier to develop and create cool things when the framework isn't necessarily make it very easy. You can still work around it. Yeah, that's it.
Awesome. Questions for Dennis? Okay, cool. I think it's an awesome example of there's a blog post. It's probably about a year old now, but it was a criticism of Ember that said like all Ember apps look the same. And obviously, like looking at this and looking at the first app that Kevin demoed, and and other apps that obviously that is the opposite of true. But congrats on the amazing progress in this. Great job. Cool. So you guys are probably wondering, did the speaker show up? He's in the back, and he's here. We're going to take a quick break before we bring Alex up. So I have a couple of requests for you. One is do get up and stretch. Two is do introduce yourself to somebody here that you don't know. And we'll be back I'm going to call everybody back in just 3 or 4 minutes. So grab a drink if you want, say hi to somebody you don't know, and we'll get rolling in a minute. Our next speaker, I've now had the pleasure of introducing a few times. He is one of the more unique developers in the New York community. He looks at the world in a slightly different way, and is one of the really the best minds in understanding and working on internals. This gentleman did the bulk of the work on the router, particularly all of the promises features that really make the router work and be as flexible as they are needed for real world projects, such as what Dennis was describing. If without the promises support, the stuff that Dennis described, which was showing, would be nearly impossible. So, without further ado, to tell us about what Angular looks like from an Ember insider's point of view, Ember.js core team member Alex Machnier.
Thank you. All right, here goes. I get to talk about Angular, and I get to try to do it in a completely non-snarky way, as is very tempting to do from an Ember perspective. Turns out, just going to cut to the chase, I like Angular. It's fun to work on. I feel like I'm putting stuff together with erector sets and seeing how everything works, and it's fun to get your hands dirty in it. But there's obviously a lot of things that aren't very clear, like as to what the equivalent Ember mapping is. So the purpose of this is to sort of dig in and sort of get an idea. If you've heard the word transclusion before, hopefully you'll come away with an idea of what that is and whether or not you should be trolling that term as an Ember developer. You'll have an idea of what a directive is, and hopefully an appreciation of that, and hopefully get some gears turning as to whether you can imagine something like that making sense in the Ember world. So without further ado, here's a picture of me. Also, for what it's worth, if you're wondering at any point why I just start getting some dance moves on, it's because I'm inspired by this Britney mic it's been the first time I've ever had a chance to wear it. And also misdirection in case, the material goes thin on the Angular stuff, which I don't think it will, but we'll see. So, yes, a little sketch of myself this morning. I'm on the Ember core team. I'm the author of the Emblem.js, which is an indentation-based templating language which you can use as an alternative to handlebars. And I do New York-based JavaScript consulting. And I'm available on GitHub and Twitter, MACHTY. So, comparing these two frameworks, let's start with the one that we all apparently know and love the best. What is Ember.js? So description, the first thing that's going to sort of slap you in the face when you go to emberjs.com is it is a framework for creating ambitious web applications. And we'll see sort of how that aim might be the same or might be a little bit different from what Angular is trying to do. It's currently at version 1.1, the 1.0 release, and ideally, demonstrably, the end of a lot of code churn and the settling of a lot of concepts was about 2 months ago, I think, maybe a little bit more. Minified and gzipped, it's 67 kilobytes. Actually, I forget if I included jQuery in that one, but that's at least Ember plus its handlebars dependency. Otherwise, unminified is 238, which you'll see how Angular compares in just a moment. Officially, Ember was a thing in 2011 when it forked from Sprout Core, and a lot of that time has been spent sort of whittling away at what we don't care about Sprout Core and turning it into what the ideal vision is for Ember. But like I said, it's 1.0 now, so it's definitely reached a certain stage of maturity. And I can probably move on. So what is AngularJS in comparison? So rather than saying it's a framework for developing or creating ambitious web applications, AngularJS is a tool set for building the framework most suited to your application development, and that's just straight from the AngularJS homepage. It's at 1.2. It's had its 1.0 for a while. It is in many ways half or less than half the weight of Ember. Whether that would actually show up and have implications is another question, but important to know. Has way less API surface in Ember. It's not on this slide, but it's definitely a truth. There's definitely more to learn in Ember than there is in Angular. It's been around since 2009. It wasn't forked from anything. It was just sort of built from the ground up by some of the guys that are still involved on the core team today. It doesn't have any dependencies in the way that Ember does on handlebars and jQuery, even though it plays nicely with jQuery if it's around. And relative to Ember's 8,500 GitHub stars, Angular's got 17,000. So that's some important stuff to keep in mind. So first impressions, Ember is enormous. It is twice the size of Angular, whether it's minified, gzipped, whatever. And it also has more dependencies. So it depends on handlebars, the templating language, and it also depends on jQuery for various DOM manipulation, whereas Angular doesn't have any dependencies. You can that can be the single script tag that you can throw into your page, or JSBin or JSFiddle and stuff is going to be working, versus Ember's 3 or possibly more, depending on where you're putting your code. And like I said before, Ember's got a much larger API surface area. That's, again, nothing on the slides, but something you could probably verify if you took a look at some of the docs. In addition, Angular is hugely popular. It's got twice the GitHub stars, and it's just, as far as people searching Angular versus Ember.js, it's got some hockey stick graph proportions of popularity. So keep all this in mind. Some of this is going to come into sort of a different perspective depending on how you think about the scope of what these two frameworks are. Sure. Mm-hmm.
I just want to point out that when you do the search without the dot, it's much less of a hockey stick difference.
Which dot?
Ember.js.
Oh, really? No, I think I tried both of those. I think AngularJS without the dot is the proper way, and Ember.js is more popular. I could.
We tried it. We had the same experience. We tried it, and then somebody corrected me and said, "No, try it this way." They actually keep it nice.
Okay, that is encouraging. Yeah. Oh, and also I don't know what is. I got many encouraging things to say about Ember.
Encouraging if that was the right one. Maybe this is the right one.
Right. Well, it's I'm sort of starting low and then building up everyone's excitement. It's part of the deal. But also, for what it's worth, if there's anybody in the audience who is from an Angular perspective, I really don't mind if you yell out and say that something I cover is, slightly inaccurate or could be improved or whatever. I mean, I'm going to be operating from a position of extreme temptation for bias, and something's going to come out wrong at some point. And so it's fine. If you want to yell at me and tell me I'm completely wrong, correct me from the audience, totally great. That's going to be for everyone's benefit. So seriously, go forth. Okay, so with all that said, Ember and Angular, they're just competing front-end JavaScript frameworks, right? Well, not quite. And it sort of seems like the difference is a little bit anal retentive, but it's actually a pretty meaningful difference as to what these frameworks or tools are trying to do. So Ember.js, to restate what's on the homepage, is a framework for creating ambitious web applications. We don't sort of dance around this word framework. That's what it is. It comes with all the other assumptions that you could say about a framework. Think of what people say about Ruby on Rails or any of these other things that you learn that sort of ideally replace the kind of boilerplate code that you might otherwise have to write. Whereas Angular, there's a few things to say about it. Angular is not a framework. It is an HTML compiler. Or Angular is a tool set for building the framework most suited to your application development. I'm sure if you go around, you will also just find blog posts or even just other parts of the AngularJS site that say it actually is a framework. It is a bit of a blurry word. But considering that the creator kind of goes out of his way to clarify what it is when someone, some jerk at an Angular conference raises their hand and says, like, why doesn't this like high-level primitive exist? And that person has to get corrected. It's not a framework, fool. It's a HTML compiler. And if that seems strange now, you'll see what I mean of why it makes sense to call something an HTML compiler. But what should be immediately obvious is that Angular sort of shies away from this framework word, and there's good reasons. You shouldn't sort of come into it thinking it's going to solve all the problems and give you all the structure that you might expect if you sort of come from a background of respecting, I don't know, Rails or sort of what Ember tries to do of being like, here are all the hard problems and here are some sort of battle-tested solutions for solving it. But there is good reason for Angular, I think, to have the kind of scope it does. But let's first kind of go on and see what these sort of different scopes and different philosophies are. So we're going to call Angular a tool set, not a framework. I'm sure I'll break that rule and call it a framework in 2 seconds anyway, but again, you're allowed to correct me. So this is me paraphrasing it. We're getting into the realm where you can start raising your hand and correct me. So philosophy of Angular as a tool set. So sane web application development needs first-class support for data binding, dependency injection, and testability. And in addition, it's important to keep in mind that you don't want to step too far away from your kind of native browser primitives. Your browser knows about your DOM, it knows about elements, it knows about all of these things that it might be tempting, and Ember certainly does do this, is add a lot of sort of higher level abstractions that pile on top of each other, and you might kind of getting into an Ember or a framework like Ember not know exactly at what point is the change going to hit the thing that's real to a browser, such as changing an element, updating some text on a page. So it's very much within Angular's philosophy to stay as close to HTML as possible, as well as JavaScript, because JavaScript might have its limitations, and there's plenty of things that you can do to kind of work around them, some abstractions that you can build up in the JavaScript realm. But the further that you get from it, the less kind of real and immediately gratifying, one could argue, the code that you write is. And it's very intentional on Angular's part that you are kind of going to be getting your hands dirty with dealing with sort of DOM elements and thinking about things in terms of kind of classic HTML. And we'll see how Ember sort of takes a different approach. But also, it's a lot of the code that you might write is going to be highly compatible with just plain old JavaScript objects. I mean, I think POJOs is a pretty established term at this point, but in case it's not clear, POJO just means a boring, completely undecorated JavaScript object, which, depending on how you're using it, could have its own limitations, and Ember definitely decorates a lot of stuff on top of it, but don't let that confuse you. So continuing with philosophy of Angular, use these primitives, such as data binding, dependency injection, testability, to build your own higher level abstractions specific to whatever it is that your app is actually trying to do. The sort of opinion is that not all apps are going to be the same. Some of them might have different needs than others. One solution, one size does not really fit all. So don't waste time sort of making a framework or a tool set or converting a tool set into a framework heavier than it needs to be. And rather, depending on what your app actually needs to do and the unique problems it tries to solve, it's going to be up to you to kind of build your tools on top of it. But along the way, you are going to have that guarantee that the data binding is solid, the dependency injection and testability is solid and baked very much into the framework. And sort of just reiterating what I was saying, it's very undesirable to find yourself in a situation where you're fighting the sort of high-level abstractions enforced by a sort of a larger scale convention over configuration kind of framework. So that's Angular. That's what Angular's kind of setting out to do. Really just give you very powerful, still on the lower level side of things, primitives for data binding, dependency injection, and keeping your app actually testable. So what is more or less Ember's philosophy as a framework versus just something that you might want to call a tool set? Well, so we would basically say bringing structural sanity to ambitious applications, as we say Ember is designed to be able to aid in creating, is very, very, very challenging. Probably everyone here at some point has, in their early learning how to do some web development stuff, has tried to do kind of application level code using just jQuery, and then you ended up writing some spaghetti code because it's not clear exactly where the data needs to live and how to sort of synchronize everything that's happening in your app across the app and making sure that your state is consistent. It's a very hard, challenging problem to solve, but there are a lot of patterns out there coming even just beyond the web world of how to organize this stuff. And even if apps are different, these complex apps are very different, these patterns for addressing these different apps of these varying complexity are often the same. So a framework should embrace these high-level abstractions, try to seek them out, try to sort of crowdsource them and kind of encourage the most robust ones, and sometimes enforce, but at the very least strongly encourage you to use this. So Rails was very much this way. If you came from maybe a PHP background, you might have found yourself in a situation where like, okay, I know how to do the thing, I just need to like set the header and send this file and then do this and send this redirect and blah, blah, blah. And you kind of have to fight the framework a little bit until you like, you know, calm down a little bit and learn that there's a reason that whatever the Rails way was sort of presented to you as the way to sort of solve this problem. So that's definitely, to be an opinionated framework offering these high-level patterns and kind of forcing your app to adhere to them and sort of making it painful when you start to break away from them is kind of the point, kind of the goal. And I don't think it's too risky to say that some Angular developers would find that annoying. There's lots of people who sort of don't like to be constricted in that way and think they're smarter than what this sort of crowdsourced solution is, and that's might be totally true in a lot of cases, but that's why it sort of makes sense for them to prefer something that might be better called a tool set or a foundation versus a framework. So yeah, anyway, I'll say it, convention over configuration. You know, Ember's got a weird love-hate relationship kind of with Rails. We want to say it's great, but at the same time distance it from some of the other, I don't know, snark that comes along with it. But that's very much what Ember tries to be, I think. So, and when it comes to the question of like what exactly of the browser primitives, such as just kind of raw JavaScript and plain old JavaScript objects and DOM elements, how much of that, how important is it to kind of make that sort of the stuff that you regularly deal with on a day-to-day basis? And I mean, if you're writing Ember apps, you're definitely still regularly debugging what ends up turning into DOM and elements on your page, but you are generally operating at a higher level, thinking of things in terms of views and components, and you've sort of kind of stepped away from that, and that's very purposeful. And the reason for that is that if there are high-level abstractions that can help make your life easier, it's not very important to preserve these browser primitives, which are in a lot of ways very limiting. I don't think that many people just love JavaScript. We've all found a way to make it work, kind of, sort of, but it's just riddled with all sorts of kind of gotchas and weird ways of putting stuff together. And you know, this is me speaking and largely echoing the opinions of others, but I think Ember doesn't largely see a whole lot of value in preserving that. It'll never be needlessly complicated, well, in my opinion, but there's not a whole lot of inherent virtue there, considering the other high-level abstractions that can be made. So immediately there's this sort of philosophical divergence of, you know, kind of many between the two, which is to Pojo or not to Pojo. Again, plain old JavaScript object, that's what it means. This is what a plain old JavaScript object looks like in, you know, any browser. And one that has downloaded the Ember library. Man, I feel like you guys can hear like fine resolution of every little mouth noise that goes on. Either I should pull this away or drink more of this, or both. Gross. It's grossing me out. Anyway, to Pojo or not to Pojo, again, this is plain old JavaScript object. This is something that is specific to the Ember world of things, and you can sort of tell it takes a step away from your sort of raw JavaScript that you might have otherwise used. So how does Angular embrace plain old JavaScript, and how does it make it work? So here's just a little snippet of some Angular code. There's so much to talk about Angular. It was really tempting to sort of like, here's how you do this in Angular, and then how you do this, but there's too many of those questions. So if it seems a little scattershot of what I'm actually providing an Angular example to, there's not a whole lot to do about it without making this thing like 4 hours long. But just you can sort of tell what's going on. You're going to be creating your application, and then you're going to define on your app a controller. And a controller has lots of it's pretty similar to what an Ember controller does, which is it's responsible for making sure all the data is available to the templates to render. And you sort of make that available by setting these properties on a thing called a scope. In Ember, you would set properties on the controller itself, and because the controller is the context of templates that render, a template has access to all the controller's properties. That's how you render stuff to the screen. That's how stuff gets data bound. In Angular, a controller is set up like many other things, directives and services and such, via a function, which might seem a little. It's inverting something. If you're coming from an Ember background, this is a very sort of weird thing for me to wrap my brain around of what's actually happening, because I'm used to this world of the Ember object runtime and defining something as a subclass of an Ember controller. But here you are sort of saying, okay, I'm making this thing called app controller. This is one of the dependencies that's going to get injected and passed directly into this function which sets up a controller, and this is how I set a property on that. So Angular's managed to do a lot here. It's got dependency injection. It's set up a controller which is exposing data to a template to render. And it's done all of this just using plain old JavaScript objects and just functions. There's no weird subclassing. There's no proprietary object model. There's no ember.object.whatever. It's just functions and pojos. And that's kind of all over Angular. I feel like once I sort of wrap my brain around this sort of general pattern, everything else about Angular was pretty easy to learn. It follows this pattern of use these functions to construct these objects that you'll be using throughout your app. Wait, was there another? Nah. Oh, sorry. Okay, sorry. So contrasting with how Angular sort of embraces it, here's what Ember does to sort of get rid or sort of not embrace JavaScript. It doesn't really ditch it. I guess that's a little extreme. But so rather than using these functions to say, this is how I set up a controller, this is how I set up all these properties on the scope, this is sort of more Ember-y way. This is kind of a weird example because finding the perfect analog of an Angular approach to something in the Ember world, you're not going to find like the perfect kind of idiomatic Ember way of doing it. And I guess I chose this example as the way to ask the minimal amount of questions as to like, how do you set up a controller with the right data? But just some things to note here that are some pretty clear divergences from just plain old JavaScript objects is you have this idea of ember.application.create. You know, this is creating an instance of, well, an Ember application rather than like, you know, using the new keyword or something that you might expect. That's just JavaScript normally has. So already there's some magic there. There's something that Ember's kind of come in and provided as part of the framework that you can use. And then I want to make an application route, which is, you know, in Ember you've got this concept of a route which is responsible for sort of stitching together all the controllers, and it's up to the route to resolve all the data that's going to get passed to a controller. Not super important for the purpose of this talk, but that's sort of what's going on here. But what I sort of wanted to illustrate is that rather than just taking a controller and saying controller.property equals person or equals plain old JavaScript object with name Alex, you have to use this .set. And this is a very divisive issue between people who favor Angular, people who favor Ember. This is the sort of, depending on where you're coming from, the sort of maligned setter and getter requirement that Ember forces you to use. And these getters and setters provide do a lot of things through the framework. They basically make a data binding work in the way that is specific to Ember versus the sort of dirty checking approach that Angular uses. I'll come back to this idea later, this concept called the uniform access principle, right? Nice. Of how you access properties, and it kind of allows you to not have to know ahead of time whether a property is something that is data stored on the object versus, for instance, a computed property. But so already, what this is meant to sort of demonstrate is that there's some magic here. There's something here that is not strictly JavaScript. If you had just taken a JavaScript 101 class and got the gist of it, and then you saw this should like rightfully be confusing. And that's because Ember has gone ahead and defined its own object model that it expects you to use. So that's what Angular does to embrace JavaScript, because it's got to do something a little strange. It's got to do something a little indirect, because JavaScript just is not that great. And I think Angular does a pretty fine job at getting that done. And I think it's definitely right for everything that Ember is trying to do to take a step away from that and get things working using getters and setters, object model, and subclassing and such. So this is how Angular benefits from having fully embraced plain old JavaScript, in my opinion. One is that if you just want to set a property and you want it to show up in the template and have that sort of automatic binding happen that you would expect out of a data binding framework, you can just say object.foo equals 5 or scope.whatever equals something else. Versus what you'd have to do in Ember, which is object.set foo 5. I don't think there's any doubt that this is a lot cleaner. I will say that there's much to like about Ember, and you get over this sort of thing pretty quickly. But it's notable. It's there. It's one more thing that you have to learn up front, and one more thing that might surprise you if you're learning Ember and something isn't working the way you're expecting. It's like, oh, how am I using these setters? So another thing which is sort of a benefit of using this plain old JavaScript is that everything, if there's no higher level of a kind of object than just a plain old JavaScript object. There's no Ember.object that you have to think about and wonder, like, what is the magic that exists in this particular subclass of Ember objects that doesn't exist in a plain old JavaScript object? Everything, if you're kind of following the right patterns, everything is just a plain old JavaScript object, and if you just set a property, you can expect the data binding to work. Obviously, there are some caveats. I can come back to that in a second. So an object model, when I say this, I'm just referring to all the code that makes Ember.object.extend and Ember.application.create and all this stuff that Ember's sort of done behind the scenes. That's what I'm talking about, an object model. A proprietary object model is one less thing to learn. In Angular, there is no such thing as that, and all you're using are these plain old JavaScript objects. So that's one thing to think about. I think some people can find Angular pretty easy to pick up because there isn't that sort of extra brain hurdle. Also, just if you're debugging an Angular application, there's always going to be that part of the framework, if you go enough stack levels up, that just makes zero sense, and it doesn't have to make sense. But along the way, if you have to use .set in the way that Ember requires you to do, that's going to be more stack frames, just kind of more stuff between all the relevant functions that you might want to look through to see like why your app is not behaving the way it does. So it's worth thinking about. These do matter. These do affect the developer ergonomics. So I have examples for both frameworks, of course, of how these decisions end up kind of hurting them. These relative tool sets or frameworks, whatever you want to call them. So Angular, there's, as much as you can still do lots of things with plain old JavaScript objects, there's still this sense of magic. At some point, you're going to reach some use case where things just don't work the way that you expect them to. And usually that case, and some Ember veterans would recognize this as having some analogs in the Ember world, is what has to happen if you want to integrate with a third-party app. So maybe you're using a jQuery plugin that does something, does some weird calculation, comes back with a value asynchronously, and you want to take that value and you want to throw that so it's wherever it needs to be to display in your template. In Ember, you kind of have, well, I'll come back to how that happens in Ember, but in Angular, you've got to know like a little bit more about how this data binding works, how dirty checking works, and you have to be very careful that to kind of run these changes that update the scope that is basically what gets passed to your templates. You have to be very careful to run it within this thing called apply, which is kind of like ember.run or whatever, if you all know about that. Otherwise, you won't know why, but the data that's clearly coming back from this third-party library just isn't updating throughout your app. It's not very clear why. So there's still magic there. Ember's got a lot of magic stuff. You might not understand exactly where all this machinery is coming and what it's doing for you. No doubt, there's a lot of Ember magic, but it's still there in Angular, and it can still surprise you. It's not a foolproof system. In this particular case, that's something that I think Ember handles a little bit more elegantly, even though you still have to use those getters and setters. So another thing, I'll come back to this. Maybe if someone wants to ask me about it, it's a question. I don't really address it later, even though I promise broken right away. Oops. Yeah, tell Stefan Fenner. Is he here? That's too bad. He's rolling over in his Canadian frigid block of ice. Wow, that was really self-disorienting. What was I saying? So another sort of raw JavaScript concept, even if it's more on the advanced side, is this concept of prototypal inheritance. And this is used in a few different places throughout Angular. Maybe a few, maybe it's just the one that I'm thinking of, which is in scopes. Again, templates and all the HTML that you would write in an Angular app are going to be displaying and binding to values that are set on this thing called a scope. And you can have parent controllers with child controllers, and they have child controllers, and oftentimes there is a child scope associated with each of those. And the way that's implemented is using prototypal inheritance, which seems sort of like a nice thing that Angular is doing because, again, it's another example of Angular embracing something that's just native to normal JavaScript. There's a thing called prototypal inheritance. Objects have a prototype, and those things can have a prototype all the way up to null. And that allows you to look up values and share values between these sort of parent prototype objects. But there's a lot of things that can be very tricky, some gotchas associated with what happens when you retrieve a value out of an object that has a value defined on a parent prototype versus setting that object. And there's one in particular which catches a lot of Angular noobs off guard, which is what happens when you try to bind to a primitive, like a string or a number. And what ends up being the solution to that is like, oh yeah, remember, there's all this stuff is implemented based on this sort of raw prototypal inheritance. So if you want to set a property that it's bound to, you have to use a JavaScript object versus these primitives, or else you're just going to end up kind of trolling yourself in a subtle way. You know, veteran Angular people would see this immediately, and I'm sure there's lots of weird little gotchas that I know about Ember that I don't even think about anymore, but it's something to think about. You can't really hide or get around that if you're just embracing it because it's, you know, just feels inherently good to do what you can to adhere to these basic pure JavaScript concepts. Sorry, gotta lubricate the otherwise desert status uvula. So how does Ember benefit from its decision to get away from this boring, pure JavaScript? Boring, that's not the word to use. But basically, even if it's a little confusing as to how all this stuff works, you can very quickly, if you've got a background in object-oriented programming, to see how you can compose these classes. You can have another class which inherits a mixin, which, you know, can have its own state, and you can separate all these things and use all these like classic battle-tested patterns. Like particularly if you're coming from Ruby, I think Ember's object model is a nice thing to have available to build whatever additional abstractions you need in addition to what's sort of provided to you by the framework. And this is another promise that I'm going to break. We can come back to it. This uniform access principle. There's a sort of like half-made slide, but in the end it didn't make sense to talk about it, but I can come back to it if it's important. But these setters and getters, aside from just being like a nuisance that you have to use in order for data binding to work the way that you expect, can really enable some powerful patterns which aren't even going to be remotely available anytime soon, I don't think. Even with some of the changes that are being made to ES6, like the newest specifications for the next version of JavaScript that's coming out. So for instance, we have this concept, Ember has this concept of object proxies, where you can sort of decorate an underlying object with values specified on the proxy, and if you try to set a value you can basically implement something that's very similar to method missing in Ruby and do lots of fun dynamic things if whatever problem you're trying to solve calls for it. And there's this thing called computed frequent properties, which is also something that is benefited by the fact that Ember stepped away from pure JavaScript to encourage you and kind of force you to use these getters and setters. So how does Ember hurt from this? Well, there's obviously a lot of magic, and it's not kind of clear at first how far the magic goes and at what point you can get away with just using normal JavaScript objects. It turns out that you don't actually always, absolutely 100% of the time, have to use .set for data binding to work. A lot of times this is the case. You don't always have to use an instance of ember.object. You can just sometimes get away with a plain old JavaScript object. I might happen to know the answers to when that is, but it's certainly not clear to beginners. And it's just sort of more stuff that encumbers the brain when you're trying to learn this stuff. So there's a lot about this proprietary object model that makes some of this stuff a little bit harder to learn. So yeah, it's a little bit of a steeper learning curve. And it's this decision to offer this, inheritance, mixins, all this wonderful stuff, and the way that data binding works based on this system is one of the things that contributes to Ember's size in a way that Angular doesn't have to deal with, because it's not really doing anything other than dealing with plain old JavaScript objects. So sort of what we were talking about before is this philosophical divergence of how important it is to adhere to these pure kind of JavaScript and DOM primitives that all browsers know about. And another one is sort of, okay, in the end, we're just going to be rendering DOM, both Angular and Ember. In the course of building our apps, we're going to be rendering the DOM. How close do we want to be to that concept? How much do we want to be getting our hands dirty? And dirty is totally relative from my biased Ember background. But how much are you going to be dealing with the DOM? How does it work? And at what level are you going to be interacting with it? And in other words, what the hell is a directive? So the Angular directive, and this is where anyone who's into Angular can start doubly correcting me, but I think I do a pretty good job, we'll see. So remember, Angular is not a framework, it is an HTML compiler. And directives are pretty much where this concept of compiling your HTML in your app comes from. So a directive is very hard to define. I think you'll get a sense of what it is and why it's cool. But it's basically an indication to this HTML compiler, a marker, that says, okay, I'm an attribute on this element. That means take this element and decorate it in some weird way. Or I am this custom element name that I've defined a directive for. Go ahead and decorate this element in a weird way, some custom way that makes it way more dynamic than normal HTML is even capable of doing. So let's just take a look at some code. I've got, progressive enhancements to this code. I'm going to try to enhance it myself from memory, and we'll see how it goes. So, blink tag, if you were making your... Oh, bigger. I thought you were doing the blink signal. I was like, yeah. Blink represent. Okay, this is a little annoying to look at. I'm really actually doing this on purpose so I can actually make Angular look as shitty as possible. So this is Angular code. As you can see, it totally sucks ass. So, man, where do we even start with this thing? So there's a thing called a directive, which is you telling the compiler, look out for a thing that is called blink, and start doing funky stuff to it whenever you kind of go through all the HTML that you can see at the beginning of running an app. And for all those things that fit these classifications, go ahead and construct this controller using this established Angular pattern of this kind of controller constructor function. And this is how you hook in and start adding some dynamic behavior to an otherwise boring and maybe custom HTML element that would otherwise do nothing. So you should be able to sort of look at this and see everything that's going on. It should look totally weird if you're coming from an Ember perspective, but you are going to create a controller associated with this sort of with this element that is going to control what happens to it. And you are going to say, you're defining these two little sort of closures here that reference each other using timeouts. Scope and elements are two, this is sort of dependency injection based ways of taking these two services. Scope, which is what you set the data that you expose to a template for rendering. And element is something that you can use, kind of like using this $$ within, like, you know, did insert element or something like that. This is how you interact with the element that this directive is attached to. So you're going to basically oscillate between hiding and showing this element every 1,000 seconds. You can see that this works, and there's just a few more things that we want to do to improve upon this, and hopefully this will give you an idea of all these different things. I really need to drink just a little bit more. 5-10 second break. Sorry. Highly professional. There's a slide on this at the end. Okay. I don't get it, but thanks. You guys are just contributing to the, you know, applauding for Ember developer slobs. Whatever. So let's learn a little thing about how to make this work. So let's look at what this actually turns into. So here we have this custom blink tag, and as expected, the style is oscillating between display inline, display none, and that's what causes this classic blink effect to work. So let's say we want to change some of the assumptions about what actually gets rendered to the page. Say that, you know, this Angular app might run on a really old browser which still has a working implementation of the blink tag, and you don't want those to clash with what you're kind of making the blink tag do here. I mean, one thing that you could obviously do is don't call it blink, call it, you know, a blinkin, or some other thing. But we'll just stick with this for now. It doesn't really matter. Chrome doesn't actually have a working implementation of blink anymore, which sucks, but oh well. You got Angular. So we want to do a few things. In Ember world, you would define what the tag name is for a view or a component and say, I'm going to make this be a span instead of, you know, this blink as it remains. So what do? You say, here's the template that you're going to use, directive. You're going to use span instead of using a blink. And just so we can see something, we'll see what this does. This isn't going to be totally right, but it's incremental. So roll with it. So we got blah, blah, blah working. Obviously, we've lost this I am back, which is kind of what we would ideally keep on displaying. And if you look at what's going on here, let me just expand this a little bit. We still got this blink tag, and inside of it is this span that we've written. So kind of a few things to fix here. I think the first thing that makes sense is let's get rid of this blink here. We don't like this behavior that the template that we're using is actually going inside the contents of this blink tag. We want it to replace we want to replace the blink tag. We pretty much kind of want to do like an outer HTML equals some other thing. So if we want to replace that containing tag, you can use a thing called replace true. So go ahead and do that. And I think we're getting closer to the solution. We're about to use one of Ember developers' favorite words to troll Angular developers about. It begins with a T and rhymes with Schwanzklusen. Anyway, so we have this span tag. So we got the replacing working, right? So again, this is just like, you can see that Angular is already giving you some like fine-grained control over how custom elements behave in an app. Like really, this gives you more, you have to know a lot more about Ember to sort of know how to dig in and maybe make some of these changes. There's caveats to that, you'll see what these are in a second. They are kind of, Ember and Angular are kind of making you think about different things, but in Angular you have this total control over what happens when this HTML compiler matches a directive that you've defined to an element that it sees in your app when it compiles. So here's the thing that's obviously still missing is that we want this to say, I am back. And obviously we're replacing this with blah, blah, blah. And what do you do in a situation like that when you want to take content from where the directive is invoked and pass it into a chunk of the directive's template? You use a thing called transclusion. And now you will all learn what this gimmicky word actually means. So does this thing transclude? It does. Where does it transclude into? I hope this works. Nice. Yeah? I got it right. First time. So let's verify this, and we'll sort of piece apart like why this is an important concept and why it's called what it is. All right. So we got it. So here's what sort of remained in your DOM. You still have this ng-transclude, which is a directive because anything that starts with a ng and ends up in your DOM is probably a directive. ng is just sort of, if you try to pronounce it, it's like Angular. That's sort of what that means. You're going to deal with that a lot more in a thing like Angular than you would with Ember, but that just seems to be a frequently asked question. Actually, this is almost right, because there's a span and then there's a span inside of it. What am I doing wrong here? Chris? What's that? No, restrict isn't the answer, though that will come up in a second. What is it? Come on, we can crowdsource the solution to this. Ember develop. What's replace is true. Do I need to do something else with it? Take it out? I don't know. Here, I'm just going to go ahead and look at my solution. Here we go. So hopefully this one. Let's see what I did a little wrong. I don't want to spend too much time on this. We're not exactly trying to learn Angular. ng-transclude. Man, I don't know what I did. So maybe this is also wrong too. Maybe this just can't be done in Angular. And I'm just going to get like a personal letter from the Angular core team tomorrow telling me what an idiot I am. Oh, so this isn't an answer either. So I don't know. There's something that needs to be done, but my goal of sort of showing you what this transclude thing is this is actually going to roughly map to what is the yield helper in Ember. It's basically your way of taking something that is sort of passed in, like a chunk of HTML, and replacing a chunk of the view or a chunk of the directive or whatever you want to call it. So this gives you a little bit of a taste of the sort of control that Angular has. And there's a lot of nice things about this. If there's a part of you that's wondering and thinking like, wow, this seems maybe a little verbose, one, you know a lot about Ember. So slow your roll and give this a chance. There are also some other nice things. So for instance, remember that a definition of a directive is a marker to the compiler to say, take this element which matches this predefined or this ahead of time declared directive and go ahead and add some extra spice, sugar and spice to it, right? So it doesn't just have to be, there's other ways to invoke this sort of directive behavior than a element. So we could change this to a div, and we could say let's no, not ng. We'll just add blink as an attribute, sort of a Boolean attribute. It's there. The compiler is going to see it, and depending on how we define our directive, it's going to go ahead and ideally have the same behavior. So that's where this thing called restrict comes in. Because directives are flexible enough to sort of add this new behavior to any element based on whether it's the tag name of the element or because some other criterion is matched, like such as there's an attribute that matches, such as blink, or there's a class that it matches. Go away. It's up to you to sort of say like what causes this, what causes the HTML compiler to match and actually add this new behavior. So you can say restrict A. Before it was E, and that basically meant that this is an element directive. It's going to look for this blink tag and kind of add that behavior to that. We want to change it so that this code will work, so that the compiler will see this attribute and ideally make the same thing happen. And as you can see, it did. And just to confirm that this would not work. Right. So because I'm leaving this on E, this is an attribute, compiler doesn't match it, because this is restricted to only work for attributes. So this should sort of lightly blow your mind if you're coming from an Ember perspective, and the way that you've always thought about how your app interacts with the DOM is via views or components, which give you a certain degree of things to think about as far as how to render your app. Gives you some hooks into like how you can set class and other HTML DOM element bindings. But this should seem fun. Like, I hope that everyone will go home and start playing around with this weird stuff, because it's fun to work with. Again, I feel like a kid playing with an erector set, just somehow making all this stuff work. Like every one of these little things here is like, it seems a little goofy to me. It seems a little overkill, but it has its exact purpose, and it has the ability, in a way that Ember doesn't even have, to quickly switch between to add this extra behavior to an element in a way that if you're in the Ember world, like, okay, you got to sort of decide, is this going to be a view? Is this going to be a component? Is it going to be a helper? Some other thing? Maybe it'll just be a computed property that gets some value from the controller, if that makes sense. And I think, and I feel like I'm echoing the sentiment of a lot of people writing about what a directive is in Angular. I think the primitive is correct for what they're trying to do. And we'll come back in a second as to does it make sense for Ember to have a thing called a directive? Is it even possible for something like that to work? Would it ever happen? We'll come back to that in a second, but hopefully you can sort of come away with an appreciation of how to like invert your thinking on a lot of this stuff. And this whole section of the talk is basically about differing philosophies on how close these frameworks or tool sets, whatever you want to call them, get you to interacting with the DOM and thinking about things as like elements first, custom elements first with this extra behavior. And this is Angular's approach. To configure an app, you can create your own elements. I mean, I had this weird thing back when I was in whatever, 6th, 7th grade, learning just basic stupid HTML and AngelFire. I knew of all these tags. There's a div, who knows what that does. There's like a paragraph thing. And I just like thought it would be the coolest thing of all time, just be like, yeah, Alex Matchner, the coolest tag of all time. And this would just do some stupid shit. This would, display your Quake 2 clan stats. And it's not very, on its own, it's not all that compelling until someone comes along and finds a cool way to actually make, this custom Alex Matchner tag, make a little catwalk across the screen or whatever. And that's where Angular comes in, right? That's why we're all here, make cats go across the screen. But there is something nice about, rather than having to go the Ember way of saying, okay, I want this thing to be a component, so I'm in Ember world, so I've got to sort of use curlies instead of these angle brackets, when really it's just tempting to say something like X component or whatever it's called. There's something nice about being able to keep your brain strictly in the angle tags world of things. So I get it. It's fun. I like the stuff. I want to learn more. I want to fix this example so it's not spans and spans. But what's that?
According to Stack Overflow, it's not possible to get rid of that span right now.
Really? Any Angular people want to track that? According to Stack Overflow, did you just look it up? Oh, nice. Nice. Teamwork. Cool. I don't know why. That seems... I actually totally yoinked this example off of someone else, so maybe their thing never worked to begin with. You can hear everything. Oh, yeah. Yeah, I actually did that once. Question?
Yeah, you might want to use visibility inside the display so that anything that comes after it doesn't start moving around.
This is true. That optimization is left as an exercise for the listener. You might have to do multiple transclusion to get that working. I don't actually know. There's no such thing. You can only transclude once. It's true. Present. So we cover everything? Yes. So a compiler marker, that's the original definition of a directive that can take the form of look out for elements named this, or look out for attributes named this, look out for classes named this. And you can do, it'll even detect comments, HTML comments that you put in. I don't know how often people use that or what the rationale would be, but it's a doable thing. So my verdict is directives are sweet. They're fun to work with. They're fun to think about. There's a good chance that my enjoyment of working on this stuff and putting whatever little examples together that I did is based solely on the fact that it's not Ember. I'm just kind of, Ember is almost like boring to me at this point because I know how to do all these things, and to have some other way of like putting together these cool dynamic combinations of tags and components or whatever you want to call them in the Angular world. It's fun, it's new and fresh, and I definitely encourage everyone to kind of take a stab at this because your sort of understanding of how, I don't know, scopes work and maybe why Ember does things the way it does and what possible Ember limitations are, and if you're in the mood to contribute and start a dialogue, what Ember could do a little bit different. It's good to know this stuff. It's definitely a different way of thinking about things. So I'm going to try to move this along a little bit. I didn't think I had enough material, but there's quite a lot. So directive options, I don't want to go over these. Replace apparently doesn't work the way I described. Outer HTML totally doesn't work, my bad. Directive options, restrict, E for element, A for attribute, and a bunch of other letters for comments and classes and whatever else you want to have your Angular HTML compiler look at your code and then add behavior to stuff. And as I already covered, there's a thing called transclusion. And since the beginning of time, when desperate Ember core team members were looking for things to say sucked about a competing framework, but not competing because it's a totally different category because it's only a tool set, we would commonly rail on this idea, this word called transclusion. I'll come back to this a little bit because Ember is very opinionated in the way that, Ember has strong opinions on what an API should be, what should developers have to know about, how deeply do they need to, should people have to sort of interact with DOM elements, and if possible, choose a more fitting day-to-day word than something like transclusion or directive. But anyway, Angular didn't make it up, so we can't slight them for it. It's an actual concept that exists that, generally speaking, just means a way of taking content and injecting it into another thing. So my spending an hour talking about Angular and Ember meetup is an example of transclusion. Score 1 for Angular. And anyway, so I think I mentioned this already. If you're thinking like, what is the Ember equivalent? It'd be to use the yield helper, and you'll see an example of this in a second. So what else can there be to say about directives before moving on? I don't know why this IE is split, but man, what did I even write here? Right, so the one thing that didn't show up in this JS fiddle is another thing that you have very explicit control over. And you have it in a certain degree in Ember, but it's not as first class. It's not presented as an option next to all those other things that you might use to configure a directive, which is what happens with the scope of data that ends up in a rendered directive. Does it inherit the scope? Can it access properties of the scope or controller or whatever you want to, however you want to think about it, in which it was rendered, or does it have its totally isolated scope where it can't have access to any of that stuff? And it's kind of up to you to keep the implications of that in your brain when you make these decisions, but it's very easy if you need to make the perfect, most custom element of all time to use all these options that are available to you in a way that aren't quite exposed the same way in Ember. And I guess the question for you to sort of turn around your brain is how purposeful is that? And I'll come back to that. So does Ember have directives? Not really. And what does that mean? Is that important? So the closest equivalent in Ember is probably, again, it's not perfect, is views. Views are the object in Ember which manages DOM, whether it's a single DOM element or it's a range of DOM elements not surrounded by a element. And so as far as Angular's granularity of kind of configuring these directives, there's no concept yet of being able to just like say, hey, random elements in this template, you have these like special powers to blink every 1 second. If you're going to if you want something like that, you've sort of got to make the decision, okay, like this needs to be a view, this needs to be a component. It's possible some of these patterns might be influenced by the time this thing called HTML bars comes around to sort of make it very easy to swap the method by which you kind of add these dynamic properties to an element. I kind of doubt it. For what it's worth, HTML bars is an enhancement, sort of another layer on top of handlebars, which rather than doing a lot of rendering to strings before eventually rendering it into DOM elements, it's going to make the handlebars parser. The handlebars parser is going to be HTML aware, which means a few awkward things about having to make a distinction between whether a helper that you write is inside an HTML element, like where an attribute would be, versus whether it's actually inside the body of an HTML element. You would have a little bit more information, ideally, to sort of figure out like where you're being invoked. And I don't know what the API is going to be for that sort of thing yet. But again, at this point, Ember doesn't exactly have that as a primitive right now. And as far as I know, neither does any other of the kind of data binding frameworks. So if you look at Knockout, they're not really going to have the same thing. This is a very Angular specific thing. So in Ember, if an element needs dynamic behavior, it's got to be a view or a component. So why doesn't Ember have this thing called a directive? Why would we not just, look at this wildly successful framework and the thing that just, gets more applauses than anything, this thing called a directive? Why would we not just throw this into Ember? And there are some reasons that are they're kind of historical. Ember's kind of gone this direction with handlebars. There's implications about that. There's things we may or may not decide to do when HTML bars comes along. But there's also something to say about the different philosophies as to what a public API should look like. So Ember's API is no doubt huge. You have to know what a controller, a routes, a view, a component, helper, data binding, computed properties, computed alias versus some other thing, and blah, 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 and have to keep that in mind while maybe there's still some outdated information of old Ember versions. But it's a lot to learn. And that being said, what we end up exposing as public API pretty consistently has kind of, everything is like heavily vetted to just have the simplest possible name, and like it is obvious exactly what this thing is doing. And while I would agree that the API for Angular directive, like they all make sense eventually after, I've slammed my head on it a million times to distinguish between restrict and transclude true, or scope being just an empty plain old JavaScript object, or remembering all these other things about it. It's Angular, it's like if the tool works, if it can be used to configure your directives, that's like 99% of the job, whereas like any change that ends up making it into Ember is like so heavily vetted constantly by the community, by the core team, over and over again to make sure that like this is really like the right way to do this, the most like intuitive way, the most like aha, like that's really sort of well put together. And I think it's pretty easy for me to say that if someone came up and said like directives are really cool, it's so awesome to be able to define all of these like exact things and say how it can be activated, whether it's used in the context of an attribute or an element or whatever, just like throw it in there. It's so cool, don't you know? It's so awesome. But I mean, people write some pretty incredible Ember apps, and it's quite rare when you find. So I think I mentioned it somewhere. I'll come back to this idea of exposing every possible thing that you could use at an equal level of importance for configuring how a directive works, or a view, or a component, or whatever you want to call it, is definitely not the sort of Ember way to go. Ember's going to make you think, okay, you're trying to build ambitious web applications. Turns out, through just tons of sort of community feedback and battle testing, that you can get really damn far, if not all the way, without minor tweaking and minor, very specific optimizations, using these things called views and components. You don't actually regularly need to configure the hell out of how scope works, how transclusion works, or transclusion you use it in Ember kinda, but you end up using it, this sort of like yield keyword, in a way that I just set like a few different properties even just to make that blink example work. So I did actually have one oh, come on. Oh, yeah, I'll come back to it. Oh, I swear there's an example. So, right, so like I said, it's like Ember is going to make you think about things like a view and a component, and even then that's like a little bit of a stretch that Ember is even making you wonder what the difference between those two is. But for what it's worth, component is a subclass of a view. And it's been sort of configured in such a way to kind of foster composability, shareability, reusability, refactorability, whereas views share the scope of the parent view that they're inserted into. So as a demonstration of like an Angular API way of thinking of things versus an Ember way, in other words, an Ember component is an element restricted, isolated, scope transcluded directive. Turns out that experience shows that you never have to know that to build some pretty incredible and simple things in Ember. And whereas it's like if you're in the Angular world and you know that you eventually want to share this cool little calendar widget that you've made or whatever, you've got to be like, that's right, I'm going to be sharing this thing. It's obviously can't be like bleed and scope, so it's got to be like the scope whatever empty object, and it's got to do this other thing. It's like a recipe to sort of keep in your brain. And I think there are some higher level abstraction recipes that are more important to sort of occupy that brain space. Anyway, so like I said, it's like Ember's going to make you think there's a thing called a view, or there's this thing called a component. And if you just use those, that's going to knock out like 95% of the things that you'd ever want to do. And if there's that just final little gap for the purpose of your application that makes sense to tweak in some way, you can sort of drill down to that level. But you can learn about those things. You can learn about that 5% when the time makes sense. And then you can say the same thing about Angular. I'm sure that Angular's got quite a lot of kind of introductory guides and videos out there that are probably going to introduce one thing at a time. But even beyond what the community decides to expose to you as a sort of gradual way of learning Angular, I think the argument can be made that just the way a lot of what goes into Ember's API is structured, just from looking at the code, looking at the docs, more care is taken to make sure that the things that are most important to you are just front and center, have very clear names, just hitting you over the head, obvious of how they're useful, and they demonstrably are. So anyway, I'm talking all this stuff about Blink. So what is a Blink? What's the equivalent look like? Well, it's got to be a isolate, scope, transcluded. I don't remember stream of words. But what does something like this look in Ember? Just so for comparison's purpose, it looks something like this. There's a few different ways you could do it, but remember that the Ember sacrifice is that your at least present day, maybe HTML bars will change this. You still got to think of things as blocks of curlies. You're kind of in handlebars world because Ember has dependency in handlebars versus just going ahead and doing xblink or whatever it would be, not cblink. Oops, this is a little small, but just so you know, it's wrap this around your brain real quick. We make an xblink component. We have a function that fires when it gets inserted into the page, and no one even uses is visible. I'm like kind of think it's funny how to use this, but you're going to toggle this every time, and you're going to refire this function every 600 milliseconds. You're starting with the right conceptual tool, which is a component, which is good at doing these little small isolated things, and you don't have to think about scope, blah. You don't have to think about, oh, this is only going to be fired for elements, not attributes. You don't any of these other things. But sorry, that's a lot of negative nonsense. I don't need to be dishing out on y'all. I actually totally dig Angular. It's fun to work on, but it does have a weird approach to what to encumber your brain with for being something that favors sort of simplicity. But okay, so let's talk about something where I think Angular kicks a lot of ass. I think the previous section kicked a lot of ass. It's just so different. Anyway, so testability. I definitely think, so Angular has been around since, 2009, and it didn't have the sort of hangover that Ember might have had in 2011 when it forked from Sprout Core and had to sort of start with Sprout Core's way of setting things up and having globals and not being all that testable. And really, Angular's done an awesome job at being very easily testable in a way that, even with a lot of the recent enhancements to Ember, is still kind of nice. Some of this is going to kind of blur into the realm of there are some things that are harder to do in Angular than they would be in Ember, and because things are easier to do in Ember, that might kind of come at the expense of how testable it is, because maybe there's too many dependencies and whatnot. But either way, once you sort of get your brain thinking in an Angular sort of way, you are benefited very much by the way that they've sort of designed this framework. So early on, I got an example of just something that will work as a sort of standalone test case. Your controllers, kind of like they did, kind of like an Ember, are going to be responsible for setting values on this scope, which is going to be presented by your template. And in the Ember world, you've got to think about, okay, this is going to be a subclass of Ember controller, and then I got to create this, and then maybe there's some other things I got to connect because the way that controllers tie into dependency injection works a certain way if the router exists versus other things. Anyway, there is an Ember-y way of doing things, but the fact that this is one of the things where Angular sort of shines, because controllers are nothing more than these functions that are past all their dependencies and do a pretty simple thing. So in this case, if this people template or whatever that is driven by this people controller needs to display a person, you don't actually need to go all the way. You can. There are options to testing what this final output of that template is going to be. But so long as you can run this people controller and pass into it its stub dependencies, if by the end of running this, just run in the controller like a normal function, if the scope object that you send in has all the values that it expects, then you know your controller has done the correct thing. And that is a very, very easy thing to test. And it's for that purpose that they've made it that way. I do believe controllers are among one of the easier things to test in Angular. I think my brain is just out of room for stuffing more reasons as to why directive testing is apparently a slightly bit harder, but whatever. This is awesome that you can test something this simple. Albeit a very simple example, but this is, if you've got some questions as to why Angular is structured a certain way, why do they do this, why is this just a function versus a subclass, this is one of the benefits. This is very intentional. They made it this way, and hopefully you can see why that's cool. I probably should have had an Ember section. The Ember story on this real quick is that for a long time, Ember testing was not very well supported. You could kind of do these end-to-end tests, maybe enabling your JavaScript engine and Capybara or whatever you're doing, but it took a long time for testing to sort of catch up in Ember. At this point, it's pretty good now. I don't need to talk about Ember right now. This is everyone learned about Angular, right? But one thing about testability, it's been baked in since the beginning. They've done it right. It's quite cool. Performance-wise, these are very, very generally speaking. I don't think there's a whole lot of intelligent things that can be said about performance, but here are just some things to know about. Plenty of people have gone to the Ember discourse and been like, hey, I made this benchmark of rendering 5,000 elements and it totally sucks in Ember. Here's the profiler. Here's we can see that 30 garbage collection events happen in a row, whereas Angular only has this many and it's clearly much faster. So that's totally true. When it comes to list rendering, particularly in these pre-HTML bar days, I don't know how much it'll change when it's around, but it should hopefully get a lot better as we switch away from string rendering to strictly emitting these DOM nodes. But there are some issues. So for instance, if you start adding binding to the picture, and one of the ways that you can watch for changes in an array, Chris, correct me if I'm getting any of this stuff wrong. Once you start adding these other considerations as to what's up, good, sweet, yeah. This is also an international sign for approval too. Good, yeah. So anyway, so so once you start thinking about what your app actually needs to do beyond just rendering a big chunk of arrays, if those arrays are going to be watching for changes, the way Angular is set up is that you can define for a given scope what that is, kind of expressions that you're watching and when that changes, you can update the scope and re-render. And once that consideration comes in there, Angular really starts to go downhill. And just like in Ember, there are ways for you to kind of dig in a little bit more and think about more clever ways of constructing this stuff. It's tricky, but that kind of drilling down to that level exists for both the framework Ember and the toolkit Angular. But it's not very clear if there's just one that just kicks ass all around the board. There's a lot to consider when just saying, like, which one's faster? But so what I can say is just sort of what the future of both of these are is that Ember's going to this is going to improve a lot for Ember once HTML bars is a thing, and Angular is going to benefit a lot from object.observe, which is a way of watching an object for changes that is going to hopefully be widespread in browsers soonish. I mean, I think Ember is also going to benefit from such a thing, but it's like both the framework and the toolkit, it's so silly that I'm even calling it that, are just going to get better as our browsers get better, and Ember is obviously going to benefit from its own HTML bars thing. So final thoughts, there are definitely more things I could say about it. I could talk about what are services and providers and what's the right way to think about them if you're used to kind of creating these controllers in Ember as places that like maintain certain application state and such, but it's just too much to say. So my final thoughts are basically I enjoy Ember a lot. I like the amount I've had to learn just to be like moderately intelligent throughout this talk has been fun for me to think about why they would do it that way, why it's cool, and it's just kind of just brain expanding to work on. So I heavily recommend find someone to pair with and spike on making something in Angular. It's fun. The first time I even messed with Angular was like 3-4 weeks ago. I got to go to Seattle and meet a dude, Gordon Hempton, who's been like an inspiring Ember guy since I've been learning this stuff. And it was just fun to figure this stuff out. And when you're so used to thinking of stuff in the Ember views and components and helpers, it's just nice to do something fresh for a change that somehow magically, for certain things, finds that same degree of magic, of things automatically updating and working your brain in different ways. So give it a shot. It's very cool. I do have to say one sort of last sort of high-level thing about the implications of Angular's sort of intentional low-level focus and Ember's intentional high-level focus. Sort of reiterating some lessons before, but one thing, there's definitely a decent number of some pretty large-scale Angular apps. There's way more medium-scale apps. I don't even really know what a low-scale app is, but Angular, from the beginning, from its philosophy and what it says about itself as being a tool set versus a framework, has never intended to find, like, here are all the right answers, here are these high-level abstractions, we're going to force your app beyond a certain degree of defining your directives and knowing enough about dependency injection. It's not going to say that, okay, this is how your app should be structured, because you might not understand it now, but once you start having to keep a million of these things in sync, or hooking up to some backend, or working with this thing, or solving all these other problems, which are just giant scalability hurdles, Ember is really trying to set out and find the right patterns for that, and really make you use that, even if you don't know why yet. Angular, you can always build those higher level things, but after a certain degree, you're kind of at the end of what Angular forces you to do, of how Angular forces you to structure an app. And if there's some Ember veterans here that try to learn Angular, you might go into that and take a lot of your knowledge of stuff that Ember's forced you to do and be like, oh, well, clearly I need like a repository of controllers that all know how to talk to each other, and I'll just like sort of shift their definition to the closest Angular thing. And you might actually do pretty all right, and maybe you'll be one of those whiz kids that is one of the few that's working on the really large scalable apps. But it's one of the kind of less fortunate things that can happen is that there isn't a whole ton of agreement on really what are the best kind of high-level abstractions for putting these apps together. Everyone's got a different idea. If you were working at one Angular company that's making some giant thing, and you dropped in somewhere else, you'd really have to learn how that app was put together. I mean, Ember's not going to get rid of all of that, but very much so. It's very true that because a lot of it is so structured, if something goes wrong in an Angular app, even on your first day somewhere, you'd be like, okay, this view is going wrong, and it was wired by this route, because you'd really have to be doing something crazy to have it rendered another way. I mean, after you get over the learning curve, you kind of know where everything is. You know largely where all this stuff could have, what had to take place for everything to get on the screen where it is, and you kind of know what high level, abstraction is kind of going awry and what to debug. So again, I posted some, Hacker News thing that some people thought was fair and accurate to the different intents between Angular and Ember, and that sort of fueled the interest to make this talk happen. But it's not that Angular apps can't scale or anything. It's just that there's a lot less agreement on that sort of stuff. And it's nice to have something like Ember come along where if it's a pattern, if you're being forced to do it that way, it must be such a ridiculously battle-tested pattern that even if you don't choose to completely understand it, you're going to benefit in the long run. Again, sort of a convention over configuration sort of way, in a way that Angular is kind of going to very purposefully not try to do. So I believe that is it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alex. We've got time for some questions. So I'll open up the floor. I'm going to run a mic out to you so that we can get it on the video.
So one of the things I looked at with Angular is there's a Angular modules, ng-modules org, and I'm kind of envious of that as a Ember user, and I'm wondering if there's some stuff we can learn from that to kind of create more of that type of ecosystem. Did that come across in your?
Yeah, definitely. I meant to actually have a slide on that. There's too much to say about Angular. Modularity is a slide right next to the testability part is done very well in Angular, kind of for the same reason that Angular didn't fork from anything. It was built from the ground up, and it was also built at a time where a lot of these good ideas had been somewhat settled on. For a long time, the way to import different code into your app was to just add a script tag, and it would basically, the scripts that would load would look for some global object and decorate it in some way, or just litter the names or the window with more global objects. And it took a long time for Ember to sort of get away from that. There's a lot that still can be written in like a very kind of global sort of way. Like, I don't know, there's got to be some example here somewhere. And it's like, so even here's an example, which still looks, depending on like what build tools you're using to kind of compile all your Ember code, this is still like a pretty idiomatic way to go in a way that it would not even really be possible in Angular. But it's still kind of bad because here you are just taking this application object, which is kind of also a namespace of other classes, and you're kind of falling into the same pattern of globals that would be nice to get away from. But for what it's worth, there's like also been tons of development, particularly in the last year, of being able to register these classes in a way that favors the Ember container, which is kind of the Ember equivalent of like Angular's approach to dependency injection, which kind of sidesteps a lot of that need for globals. And particularly the build tools like Ember App Kit do a nice job of you basically have an ideal file system structure for all your app code, and the way it all gets compiled is rather than littering this global namespace in a way that maybe you'd be used to from like kind of classic ways of using the Rails asset pipeline, they all get registered as modules. I guess modules may or may not be the right word in the case, but it's very modular, and it's just a matter of just more fully realizing that transition and other people stepping away from that global pattern. Is that what you were asking, or largely?
Actually, so I'm actually an Angular developer, and I've built very ambitious Angular applications, and I am actually learning Ember. But my answer to you is kind of similar to what Alex was saying, but Ember App Kit is where you want to go. And when you are able to use imports and exports using ESX transclusion, that's what I would say is the Ember answer to Angular modules. So I would highly encourage you to look at Ember App Kit.
So with Angular, there seems to be this ecosystem of modules, kind of, and I know there are like components and there are kind of modular things with Ember, but it's kind of like the Ruby gems of like front end development, I think, and that's something I think that we could probably build upon or like look at and kind of rip it off.
Yes, please agree. There's some experiments in progress with using Bower as that distribution mechanism, and the modularity that these guys just described will help a lot, but I totally agree that that's going to be huge for the Ember ecosystem. Other questions?
I was just wondering if you had any thoughts about taking an existing server, mostly server-side application, and adding either Ember or Angular, and what are the challenges of one or versus the other?
What does it mean to add to a server-side application?
I mean, maybe some of the demo that I guess Kevin showed, where it was mostly a sort of server-side solution, but then that one component, that card component, was an Ember application. Implementing something like that in Angular, would that be any easier, harder, or any challenges with that?
Luke, I don't know if you'd even know more, given what the example.
Yeah. So I think the key thing, the key difference between the two frameworks, or the tool set and the framework, is with respect to that question, is that Ember really does want to own your page, if you will. So you can compose multiple Ember apps on one page, but today that is, there's some work to do to make sure that is working properly. Whereas my understanding of Angular, at least, is that it's a little bit simpler to drop in Angular for a little section of a page today. In the case of the project that Kevin showed, the flow was basically step one, introduce some JSON APIs that didn't exist yet, right? To be able to expose data to the front end. Step two, start to refactor some crazy jQuery spaghetti into sane Ember pieces. And I think if we're talking about most modern server-side apps, it's really like rendering a bunch of HTML and then doing a whole bunch of jQuery spaghetti on the front end. So that unraveling is a big part of the challenge. One of the things that, and I did a presentation about this several months back at this meetup that you can find the slides for us at some point, but the step-by-step refactoring from jQuery spaghetti to Ember I found very manageable. And I haven't tried doing that with Angular. Maybe it's just as manageable, but because Ember uses jQuery as part of its view layer, it was a nice kind of step-by-step progression.
It's actually, yeah, there's probably something more that could be said about that, because that kind of goes into the realm. I'd mentioned, so what are some of like the drawbacks to Ember ditching like pure JS? It's that a major one is that people that might be getting started with Ember, that might be thinking about using it, have less of an idea of where the magic is. And if you've got some spaghetti jQuery that might progressively be refactored, you might not know how or that it can very easily plug into Ember objects, and that it's in the course of refactoring, it's very much possible for you to leave something which is kind of ugly but functioning in a section of your app that you'll hopefully revisit later, but you might not immediately know. You might not trust that it's something that's going to work, given that Ember has like a certain degree of magic to what makes its data binding working. Whereas Angular, there's some rules that you need to follow, and you need to occasionally know about this, scope apply stuff. But because there's no concept of like the weird object model that Ember might introduce, it might seem less magical. It might make a refactor seem a little bit more manageable. So I just would go to say that these refactors are totally possible, totally doable, and I've had it's actually kind of fun for me to take just really crappy, jQuery spaghetti code and make it work. But just know that it's doable, and that try not to find some of the Ember magic too daunting, because it usually doesn't actually get in the way as much as you think it might.
Other questions? I have a softball for you. So you talked a little bit about, a few times about Ember kind of forcing you to do something in one way. I wonder if you can share a little bit more about like how Ember's APIs are kind of composed and layered, and the question of like being forced into something.
Sure. Man, what's a good example of that? So, well, maybe I guess a good starting point is, I try to frequent the Ember discourse, and there's someone having trouble. I posted some thread on components and some ideas I had about extending them, making them even more kind of composable, and hopefully get some sort of ecosystem of components going, as you were sort of suggesting. And this is someone coming from Angular that came in and just like, why do you guys keep on talking about components when they're clearly just inferior to directives? Like why can't you like take your directive and inject this like service for fetching this and this XHR thing? And I don't know if this is exactly the example of. I mean, this is sort of an example of like try to learn how a framework wants you to structure something before saying that, oh, this functionality is clearly missing, because you're going to look at something like directives in Angular and think, wow, it's got it all. It's flexible to decorate an element. It's got a lot of that dependency injection that you would expect. But when I actually started hashing through some examples of what this guy was trying to do, I ended up throwing some of this logic into a route object. And in Ember, a route object has the responsibility of fetching all the data that corresponds to that route, that URL that you're on, and then eventually passing it to the controller. And, it was kind of one of those annoying things that would have been better if you just kind of went through the guides, but it ended up just like, wow, at the end of it, he had hit a concept of like, as much as I thought this like dependency injection working this very specific way and being available to all directives was the most important, awesome thing in the world. It turns out that if you kind of do a thing the Ember way and embrace where all the this data resolution belongs in Ember app, then it's very easy to pass data wherever it needs to go. And so I don't know. I mean, that's sort of comparing Ember versus Angular, but there are ways that you can fight Ember and maybe try to do all of your AJAX queries in a controller if that's sort of what you're used to doing. Whereas if you follow the guides, which are going to sort of set you on the path to begin with, or if you read some of the documentation that says why a lot of this data lookup and async operation stuff happens in a route versus a controller, you will benefit, and you'll definitely think about things in the Ember way, and you'll write a lot less code, and you'll be a lot less frustrated. And in the long run, your code will be a little more robust than if you tried some other sort of off the beaten path way.
Cool. Yeah, I think the reason that I asked is just the experiences that I've had where there's a piece of Ember that doesn't fit my problem. I often find that there is an API that fits it very well. So Dennis's example earlier about container view, like the tried and true path for rendering an Ember view is to have a template, right? Have a route that creates a controller and a template that renders it. When that doesn't fit, in Dennis's case, it didn't fit. There's a container view that's like a very good fit for the problem. So my reaction to kind of the idea of like Ember forcing you down a path is like that maybe that term was a little too strong. It's like yes, guiding you, absolutely, saying like this is probably the way you want to go, but when you need to step off that path, there's a lot of good options there.
Yes.
Kind of my experience.
Clearly, the overarching thing is that Ember is sweet. But yes, along the way, it could have been better.
It is the Ember meetup. With that, I want to just say thank you very much for Alex for digging in and preparing a great presentation. And to all of you for coming out. We're going to go to Lily's on 17th Street. I will pull it up on this screen in case you want to know exactly where it is. And thank you all. We'll see you in January or at Hacker Hours in December. Thanks, everybody.